Go ahead, Jeff.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I am Jeff Fox, Senior Fellow at the East West Center, and I welcome you today to this webinar, which is funded by the Luce Foundation through grants made to the University of Hawaii and the East West Center, as well as Michigan State University. Today's talk is entitled The Changing Lives of Southeast Asia Rivers, and we have 4 excellent speakers, I believe, 2 on insular Southeast Asia and 2 on mainland Southeast Asia. First is Anthony, I should have practiced this, Medriano. Presidential Young Professor of Environmental Studies at Yale University, Yale NUS University. Prior to moving to Singapore, he was a ZIF Environmental Fellow at Harvard, and he's an alumnus of Humboldt University, Hawaii, and the Wisconsin and the East West Center. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my keyboard. Then we have Rita Padawangi. She is currently a senior lecturer at the Singapore University of Social Sciences. She was appointed on July 3rd, 2017. Previously, she was senior research fellow at the Asian Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. So welcome, Anthony and Rita. Then moving up north, we have north or south, depending on how you're looking at this, Dr. Keith Barney, who resides in Australia and is a professor at ANU and has a PhD from New York University in Toronto, and his other masters from Toronto, New York as well, and then a degree from Guelph. But he is now working in Laos, so we will be hearing about the mekong from him in Laos. And then finally, Dr. Ming Yong, who is a fellow here at the East West Center, works with me. She does trans-boundary water governance and environmental governance, community-based natural resource management, public participation, development, and its impact on livelihoods and environment in the Southeast Asia region. So I'm going to turn it over to Anthony first. He's going to have to leave us early today because he's teaching a class. If he wants to give a little bit of background on himself, he may. And then, we have decided to focus on 3 questions today. And so then he will lead into the first question. Does it mean to change the social and ecological life of a river? What are the historical and cumulative aspects and impacts of the process? Okay, Anthony?
Great. Okay, thanks, Jeff, for the introduction. Thank you, panelists, for being part of this great webinar. Thanks, Jamin, for being the moderator.
Jeff, maybe move on while we try to fix Anthony's connection.
The excuse me, the digital expert.
Anthony, butt in anytime you can get going, but for the moment, and that might, you want to talk just without your image?
The Zoom expert. So I'm going to just quickly talk about myself and then
No, still not working.
address that first question. Looks like my video. Maybe we can. Okay. So it's
Anthony,
it's saying
why
that I
don't
can't
you
add
give-
on the video, but
Anthony, we can't hear you. I'm going to ask Rita to speak first. And then Anthony, when you figure it out, let us know.
Oh, I see. Relates to rivers in the sense that
Anthony's in the field to teach a class and we're just having real problems there.
I look at history, the history of rivers and the history of science. Jamin wants to keep the video off.
All right, Jeff, I heard that you're giving me the cue to go ahead. I was actually waiting for the remaining sound from Anthony. I think there's a bit of a time lag there, but yeah. Sorry, Anthony, that I think the connection really broke down. Right at it always breaks down right at the time we need to speak, right? So so I hope my connection works right now. Jeff, is it okay on your end?
You are doing very well, yes.
All right, okay. So maybe for the sake of the discussion, can you repeat the first question again to just get it going? Jeff, you're muted.
And I've got a broken keyboard, so I can't do much. What does it mean to change the social and ecological life of a river? What are the historical and cumulative aspects and impacts of this process?
All right. Okay. So what are the historical and cumulative impacts of this process? I am an urban sociologist by training. So when I look at rivers, and I will have a particular example of a river here in our discussion. When I look at rivers, I usually examine the changes around the river based on the changes in terms of the social life of the people around the river with regards to the impacts of urban developments. And when we talk about Southeast Asia as a region, actually after the end of the Second World War and the region enters this phase of industrialization, as well as rapid urbanization, actually, that's the time when rivers actually change very much, not just because of the kind of concentrations of population that are changing along the rivers, but also about how the rivers are being treated as industries are actually growing in this region. Now, the case that I'm going to highlight today is actually from Indonesia, and is from an area of the current capital of Indonesia, which is the river Ciliwung. Now, if we look at the historical map, actually, I have to credit the Future Cities Laboratory here in Singapore for these maps. We can see that this is the mapping of the changes of the land use of the river, at least since 1972. Now, 1970s was actually the peak of this rapid urbanization in Southeast Asia. And it continued throughout the 1980s as well, and 1990s. But as you can see, the color code says it all. When it was very much green in 1970, well, I wouldn't say that it's very much green. Actually, 1970s is, you can see that the river system was already changing by then. But the modeling at that time was to predict if the urbanization rate is going at this pace, what will happen by 2030? Now, the two images on the right are actually the numbers. The C image is 2030 BAU, business as usual, if no intervention is done. And then D is actually 2030 with some interventions, right? So anyway, I just want to share that first, just to kick off the discussion, that I think when we talk about changing rivers in Southeast Asia, we really need to talk about development, urbanization, industrialization that really changes the social, not just the environmental, but also the very intricate social lives that are related to these environments, as rivers are actually very important to the lives of the settlements historically also in this region. All right, maybe I'll stop there first.
Anthony, do you want to try again?
Yes, if you can hear me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Rita, for speaking to the kind of contemporary case of rivers in Indonesia and their future changes. In terms of history, a lot of the rivers have always been used by different societies. I think an important thing about rivers along the Straits of Malacca on the Sumatra side is that they were fairly recently settled in the 1880s by various overseas Chinese migrants. And these Chinese migrants, Hainanese, Hokkien, Teochew, they introduced a range of new kinds of changes, fishing practices, as well as technologies, the different kinds of nets and traps that were being used, and the scale of those traps and nets. And I think these social or historical transformations have very much transformed the life of the river, not just socially and economically, but also ecologically in terms of the amount of aquatic life being extracted and harvested. And of course, that changes as well, and in a significant way after World War II. Prior to World War II, a lot of nets and traps were made out of rattan, and the traps themselves are made out of mangrove. This obviously had an ecological impact on the mangroves that were around these rivers, specifically like the Rokan or the Asahan. But after the war, what was really significant was the introduction of nylon nets and plastic-based nets, and these nets increased the scale of catch. So I think in thinking about how a river life's change, or how the life of a river changes, we can think about technology, we can think about different communities and the settlement and the expansion of those communities, as well as kind of the ecological baseline, the fish, as it were, and how those fish populations change over time. Some increase as food fish become targets, as other fish become targets. And then we get introductions as well, biological introductions, which I can probably speak to a little bit later. But I think, yeah, maybe I'll kind of leave it there on the Sumatra rivers. Back to you, Jeff.
I hear birds in the background, Anthony.
That's right. I'm at the Padawangi River now.
I'm jealous. Okay. Ming Lei, do you want to speak to this question? Do you need me to reread the question?
It's okay. I've got it. Let me just share slides as well. Okay. So as a human geographer, I've worked a lot on Mekong River in Thailand and Cambodia, and I'm especially interested in multi-stakeholder responses to hydropower development along the river. But I'm also really interested in nature-society relationships along the Mekong River. So, how livelihood activities, cultural and religious events, and social life in general are organized around the Mekong River. So I'm really interested in the very unique social natures that are being produced along the river. So I think that the social and ecological life of rivers are very, very closely intertwined. They're mutually constituted. So traditionally, the social life of the river is definitely very dependent on the natural rhythms driven by the flood pulse of the Mekong River. So in this picture here, you're seeing Chiang Khong in northern Thailand, and that's where the Mekong River forms the Thai-Lao border as well. So Thailand is the bank I'm standing on, and Laos is the opposite bank. So in this stretch of the river, you can see a couple of ways in which the socio-ecological life of the river has changed. So up to the 1960s, movement across the river was actually relatively unrestricted. There were common fishing grounds between designated villages on both sides of the border, and this fishing grounds would kind of shift between the riverbanks according to the seasons. However, after the political conflicts of the 1960s, the river has seen some changes. So the river border is more strictly enforced now, which also affects the way in which common pool institutions have shifted to manage the resources of the river. There's been an increase in population and illegal fishing, and also a corresponding decrease in fish catch over the past couple of decades. So majority of the communities here have shifted to agricultural livelihoods. And over in Cambodia, so the social ecological life similarly on the Tonle Sap Lake is very closely tied to the fisheries and also the rise and fall of the lake's water levels across the wet and dry seasons. So, these livelihoods have been there for centuries. If you go to Bayon Temple, which was constructed in the 12th century in Siem Reap, you're going to see all these bas reliefs that document what life was like on the Tonle Sap at the time. But over the past decades, again, we have population growth, illegal fishing, deforestation, forest fires, large-scale commercial fishing, hydropower development, and climate change, all contributing to a drastic depletion of fish. So centuries-old relationships with the lake and fish are being disrupted. Some of the monster fish, as you can see here, this really huge fish here, are mostly gone from the river, and seeking out livelihoods in the lake is becoming increasingly untenable. So I would say of concern in the past 2 decades is, when the ecology and biophysical processes of the river has been permanently undermined to the point where it can no longer support these social, economic, and cultural dimensions of the life that have traditionally depended on the river. So these are projects like the Rapids Blasting Project that was proposed by China to create a navigation route from southern China down to Luang Prabang, which would have led to the blasting of very ecologically and culturally important rapids, if not resisted by local communities, and also, of course, hydropower dams along the river. So I can talk more about this later, but I'll pass it over to Keith.
Okay, Keith, you want to take us into Laos or wherever you're going to go?
Okay, I've also got a few slides to share. Yeah, so thanks for inviting me, Jeff, and also to the panelists. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I've been doing research in Laos since around 2004, 2005, and some of that has related to understanding rivers and changing lives sort of a river and along a river, I suppose. So looking at the sort of a historical and cumulative aspects of this has been some of my interest over the last years. And I've been visiting a certain community on the Hnbun River in Laos since the start of my PhD fieldwork in 2005. So coming up to 17 years, with the exception of the last couple of years of COVID, I would usually get a chance to visit this community just about every year. And so that sort of has provided an interesting opportunity to sort of trace the changes that are happening in a river over time with a particular community. So in my remarks today, I'll talk a little bit about the Hnbun River, including in relation to the Thun Hnbun Hydropower Project in central Laos. I'll talk a little bit about the Seikaman River in southern Laos, hopefully, which is also a site for intensive hydropower development through Vietnamese enterprises. And I'll touch on a few remarks on the Sepi and Se Nam Noi rivers in Attapa, southern Laos as well. That's also been the site of some intensive hydropower development. In terms of thinking about the sort of impacts of hydropower and changing lives along a river, in the last couple of years, I've been collaborating with colleagues in my department here, Sango Mahanti, Sarah Milne, Tu Swan Phuc, and Phil Hirsch. And we've been looking at this through the lens of rupture, is how we're framing it. And basically, we sort of have taken 4 sort of cuts into rupture. And a first way of thinking about it is in terms of synergistic and ecological transformations, accumulation of ecological pressures, heightened livelihood uncertainty and precarity, and new possibilities of agency along what Jerome Whittington has called anthropogenic rivers. So this is just a few pictures from Laos, and I'll just start off with from the example of the Hnbun River, and just a few examples to show sort of the heavily ecological basis of livelihoods along the river in central Laos here. I should say that, by the time of my arrival in 2005, the Hnbun was already a heavily modified river. It was already anthropogenic at the time of my arrival. So I don't want to sort of paint this as sort of a pristine ecological environment that is then, later in my story gets steadily undermined. There was already pressures happening in these areas with hydropower dams and the original Thun Hnbun project, which started in 1998. But, these are just sort of some of the pictures of actually my first day in this community on fieldwork in 2005. And, some of the people that I was talking with, and you just sort of get a sense of, sort of a life along a river, a life involving aquatic environments. You can sort of see the vegetable gardens along the side of the Hnbun River here. And, in many ways, it was a community, located right along the river. So the river was quite central to everyday life. People interacted with it in all sorts of ways, including with, daily bathing, drinking water, fishing, agriculture, all sorts of community aspects of life along a river. And, these are just some of the pictures that I was taking in my first sort of period of PhD fieldwork. It kind of seems, I guess looking at the pictures, they're sort of nice pictures. You get a sense of a community, that's engaged in communal activities. They were never a wealthy community, and there's always been different social problems, ecological pressures. Even at this time, the river was already changing, but you get a sense of a functional community life. And a sense of resource-based livelihood. So, when I was talking with people in the community, going on doing sort of ethnographic style research and accompanying them on their everyday activities, the resources of the river came up in so many different ways. And just a few other pictures here to get a sense of the fisheries, the aquatic resources that were part of everyday livelihoods as well as trade. This fellow here on the right, you'll meet him a bit later. He was always one of the best fishermen in the village. And here he's got a nice catch in his boat that he's taking downriver to actually sell in the market. And we'll meet him in a few minutes, and I'll tell a story about what has happened to the community after resettlement, basically.
I see we have a little bit of time to be flexible here. On that question, do any of the 4 of you have questions for each other about what does it mean to change the social and ecological life of a river? Do you think you're all telling the same story, or do you see something different? Clearly, Rita, yours is very different. but you may not want to go into it now.
Well, I'm saving the best of the story for later, Jeff. But
All
I think,
right,
you know,
then we'll go into the next one. We'll go into
Okay.
the next one. And Anthony's got to leave early, so let's do that. Anthony, what kind of community life, livelihood systems, opportunities, and new social ecological struggles emerge around highly modified anthropogenic and river environments, be it by dams, cities, gem mining, whatever.
Yeah, right. So if we think, I guess, kind of thinking historically, and if we just focus on the Rokon River, which is a big river in the southeast corner of Sumatra, it pours into the Straits of Malacca. That river was completely transformed
We're losing your sound again, Anthony.
by two, I'd say, upriver deforestation created a lot of. Oh, Marlon. Deforestation was a big impact on the river in terms of sediment flow, which led to a lot of mud in the mouth of the river. And urbanization was another big impact on the river. The Rokon fed a lot of the cities in island Southeast Asia, particularly Java, around Java.
Anthony, I think we're going to cut you off again and go to Rita. And then come
Singapore.
back. All right, keep going.
And it fed it in terms of really one massive product, which was the production of balachan. So that river, I think, was greatly impacted by urbanization as populations grew and other. We should go to Rita. Sorry, everybody.
All right, Rita.
Okay, so yeah, the changes, how that actually affected the social and environmental life of the rivers here. So let me just also now show you some images again from the Chilewong. So what is happening because of that very rapid urbanization? I would say that this changing course of rivers, right, in Southeast Asia is really inseparable from the kinds of inequalities that are going on in the process, both in terms of the political changes, the economic changes, and the social changes. There's so many inequalities in that process, and we have to also acknowledge that Southeast Asia is a very an inequality in countries in Southeast Asia is pretty stark. So here was I think I'll just fast forward, and I think you know that when we talk about the Chilewong River in Jakarta, right? One of the images that is very familiar to the Chilewong River is always, blamed as a source of flooding, right, in the city of Jakarta. And so the notion of this association between the image of the river and the image of floods and rivers as threats to the social and economic life is really intricate, in this particular context. And so instead of the river being very closely associated with the social life of the people of the city, increasingly rivers in the so-called like modernizing cities of Southeast Asia are seen as threats. Basically, the cities are turning their backs against the river. The rivers become places where the unwanted places instead of being this life of the city. And the kinds of interventions, oh, sorry, my slides are just jumping around. Okay. The kinds of interventions that are being done on the river. See, my slides are jumping around again. I don't know what is going on with my computer, but let me just stop it right there, okay? Because this is actually, this is the image that the image that I want to show if it doesn't really jump around again. Wait a minute. That because of this preoccupation with floods, so the kinds of interventions that are being planned on the river is really focusing on the flood control instead of looking at the bigger picture of the environmental challenges around the river. So it adds to the kinds of impacts that the communities are actually experiencing on the Ciliwung. Okay, to prevent my slides from jumping around, let me just show you in this mode, if I can get it up. All right, so so this intervention that you see in the photo is actually a very recent intervention on the upstream of the river in the name of flood prevention. So to prevent the flood from coming to Jakarta, let's build this dam. Okay, so this is not a hydropower dam. This is called a dry dam. It's supposed to be wet during the rainy season to hold the water. But as you can see, the kind of intervention on the landscape like this, it will have implications. I mean, Ciliwung River used to be a place where people actually go to fish. I mean, of course, due to the very rapid industrialization and urbanization, Ciliwung River eventually became so-called biologically dead. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that there's no fish at all in the Ciliwung. So the intervention of this dam will actually affect the kinds of fisheries that are being done along the river, especially in the upstream part of the river. And of course, environmentally as well, since there is this change to the to this built-up landscape. Now, this is the upstream, but the downstream of the river, which is in the city of Jakarta itself, the rivers become like very dense settlements, and it's often associated. I mean, I'm just saying here, it's often associated and stereotyped as the kinds of sort of like informal settlements that are dumping their trash to the river. I mean, of course, I'm using the term stereotype here because this is, again, the kinds of assumptions that are going on because we see images like this. I mean, I'm not denying that these images are real. I mean, they were real, but at the same time, this kind of images combined with the social and political inequalities that are going on really put these communities at a greater disadvantage when it comes to fighting for their own livelihoods and survival in the city. So when the arguments for flood prevention and flood control happens, these are the communities that were under fire first. And you see the kinds of interventions like on the bottom of the slide, in which you see these communities are basically being demolished to make way for these walls, like build the wall, right, to separate the river water from us. It doesn't mean that the communities actually stand still. Actually, the civil society in Jakarta at that time were quite active to fight this. So they were actually protesting against these evictions, and they were pointing out on the kinds of inequalities that were going on. So these are just some pictures from the field. These are from the communities. They were already evicted by this time. The eviction happened in 2016. So these are just some images from before, a few months before the eviction. And the pictures on the left were one night before the eviction. But then their fight for the river actually, and to live along the river actually continued even after the eviction. So they eventually filed a lawsuit, and they actually won the lawsuit. And 5 years later, now it's no, actually, yeah, 5 years after they win the lawsuit, now the community is in the phase of rebuilding. But again, these stories, it really is a story of social and political inequalities. When we talk about rivers, it's not just about the water and the land and the kind of environmental and relationship between nature and people, but also how the kinds of inequalities play into these social and environmental relationships that creates the kinds of ruptures that we see in our society today.
Thank you, Rita. That was insightful. Leads me to a couple of questions, but we'll return to that. Keith, do you want to speak to community life, livelihood systems, opportunities, and new social and ecological struggles on the anthropogenicized river?
Sure. Okay, so I'll take you back to the Hnbun again, and sort of bringing it more up to the present in terms of how my fieldwork has progressed over the years, and how what are sort of some of the changes that I've been seeing in this community, especially as Laos's program of hydraulic infrastructure and hydropower development has really sort of ramped up over the last 15 years. I'll also provide some insights from southern Laos as well on this. Along the Hnbun, I guess some of the major changes have been the expansion of the original Tun Hnbun hydropower project through the Tun Hnbun expansion, it's called, in 2013. But there's also been a series of other hydropower projects also developed on the river, a new dam at the mouth of the river where it connects to the Mekong, as well as kind of a failed dam project supported by Electricity du Laos that is still sort of half finished, that encountered some construction problems, I think involving the challenges of building a dam on a limestone system. But basically, the rupture story I would tell of this community basically involves resettlement. These days when I go back to the community, I always sort of make a trip back to the old village. The community was resettled around 5 kilometers upstream with the arrival of the Tun Hnbun expansion project. And this has created some pretty dramatic changes for the village. These are just some photos of, what with, the nice community photos I showed earlier. This is what that village looks like now, basically, after resettlement. And it's kind of a, it's sort of an emotional thing to experience and to see. A place that you have visited many times over the years, and lots of memories associated with this particular place. And you can kind of see that it's sort of returning to forest. The Hnbun Valley is now flooded out, often through intensive flooding related to the hydropower dams. Villagers certainly, especially the older villagers, they certainly miss living in that old village. They do have these smart new resettlement houses that were supported by the hydropower company. It's a complex story of change. I don't want to always sort of focus on the negative, but the problem is when I actually visit these places, I do actually see a lot of negatives. That's part of the story. I think it's part of the rupture story and the rupture experience for these communities. This fellow here in the middle, he's sadly passed away now, but he was this fascinating character who refused to move. So he said, and you can see the Hnbun River just right off of his front porch here. He told me that I've lived along this river all my life, And I don't care what the hydropower company says or what the government says, I'm not moving. And so, in fact, he didn't move. He stayed there until he passed away just a couple of years ago. And so, that it's a real sense of place and belonging that, people, it was quite traumatic for them, I think, in many ways, even though they're just moving 5 kilometers upstream. And so, what happens after resettlement, I guess? What sort of new, social and ecological changes are happening? And if I had to sort of summarize it for this community, it would be irrigation. So these are some pictures from the government and company-supported irrigation scheme that is happening in the new resettlement village. And the story about the river now is about control over water for irrigation and how that is linked to, ecological changes, social struggles. As Rita was talking about, new inequalities that are emerging. This picture on the left here just shows, control over water is now central to how this community is functioning. Who gets water, who doesn't get water, who gets water early, who gets water late. There's all these new struggles happening in the community. And basically, the community is kind of behind the 8 ball on this whole issue because they've been moved outside of their village territory. So they're now in the territory of a recipient community. And, that sort of resettlement dynamic is really sort of, shaping the struggles around land and water. This fellow here in the third plate, I was talking to him, and this is just a picture of his nursery. The young seedlings are growing up here, but he was waiting for his water. He's at the far end of the irrigation scheme, which is not a good place to be, and he's waiting for his water to arrive. And the pumps broke down. The host community got the water first. The resettlement community got the water last. And just the sense of he was almost in tears with frustration as he was watching, his nursery start to dry out. He needed the water, really quickly, or else he was going to lose his rice crop for that year. So, that's sort of micro control over water through the irrigation scheme is now how these aquatic issues are being experienced. This last picture on the far right here, to me is a story of increased precarity. This is the fellow who you met earlier, who was one of the village's best fishermen. Of course, the fish have largely gone now with the series of dams that have been built in the community. And, the last 15 years has not been good for his family. He has health problems. He's in debt. You can see here, he's waiting for the water to arrive at his far end of the irrigation scheme. And, speaking to him, you really get a sense that him and his family are really struggling. They're not one of the winners of Laos's rush to hydropower. A couple other images I can show from southern Laos, where these issues of rupture are kind of replicated. This is some pictures from the Seikaman River along the Seikaman 1 project, which is a Vietnamese state-owned enterprise project, has a large dam being built. And, the stories are kind of even more grim in some places. In this community, the irrigation scheme was completely non-functional for a couple of years after it was supposed to have started. The community lacked drinking water for 4 months before my arrival there. With my PhD student, we were on field work, so they had no drinking water in the resettlement scheme. This is a picture of the headman of the village who's telling my PhD student and I how many times his community has been resettled since the 1960s or 70s, and it was around 5 times. This is their 5th resettlement with the move from the hydropower dam. Previously, they had moved through experiences due to the wartime, dislocation due to the bombing campaign in southern Laos. They moved down to the lowlands where they were sort of displaced due to the creation of a watershed protection zone, and now again with a new dam project. And what is the experience of people who have been resettled? This is an upland ethnic minority community, but basically there are new opportunities in the resettlement area involve moving away from any sort of river-based livelihood. And this image on the bottom left here is a picture of a massive new agribusiness plantation set up by Vietnam HAGL company. And basically, the future of this community is going to be as wage laborers for a large-scale agribusiness firm. So another sort of story of disappointment and rupture I came away from that field trip with. There are new opportunities, new social ecological changes happening. There's a lucrative new reservoir fishery associated with this dam project, but local villagers are not getting a piece of that pie. The concessions for controlling the fishery were handed out by the provincial governor to people who could pay a lot of money to bid for that fishery concession. And the workers are all from around the Nam Ngum Dam or around Vientiane, who have traveled down to southern Laos to work on the reservoir fisheries. So even though there are sort of new, there's always new ecological and social changes happening. It's not as if things just disappear with the dam, but there are new opportunities, but not for local people. My last sort of slide here is continuing down the story of Rupture with Laos's rush to hydropower. And these are just some images from the Sepi and Se Nam Noi disaster scene visited in 2018 that were associated with the massive dam collapse. The saddle dam of the dam burst, and millions of cubic meters of water rushed down the Bolivan Plateau and hit around 6 villages, and basically sort of wiping them off the map in many ways. This is a picture on the left here from the resettlement, the sort of refugee camp, is hydropower refugee camp, I would call it, where people were forced to live, and the communities kind of destroyed through a massive industrial accident related to hydropower. So that is also not a positive story. Another story of rupture, unfortunately, coming away from recent research in southern Laos. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Keith. Quite comprehensive. Ming Lee, your turn, right?
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I think, these anthropogenic changes to the river, at least by state development interventions, always revolve around this idea of controlling the waterways. Flood control is a big one. That's how China also justifies its dams on the Mekong River. It's about they call it regulating the flow of wet season and dry season. But of course, communities who have depended on the river see this very differently. To them, floods are very important in terms of driving fish migrations, for ecological productivity, for bringing sediment down into the floodplains and the delta. So yeah, it's quite a bit of tension there when the livelihoods are being affected by these sort of changes to the river. So I think today I'll talk a bit more about civil society's struggles in relation to this. So in Thailand, there's been quite a long history of environmental movements against hydropower dams. So for example, the role of the Assembly of the Poor in resisting the Pakmun Dam in Ubon Ratchathani in the 1990s was quite pivotal in terms of setting the foundation for anti-dam movements in Thailand today, which is part of the reason why Thailand can't build dams in their part of the Mekong anymore, and they're buying electricity from Laos. So in Chiang Khong, which I mentioned earlier, the rapids blasting project proposed by China actually provided impetus for the environmental movement there to arise, and it's still going strong today. So in resisting the project, the Chiang Khong conservation group that was set up there actually, I think, fostered new levels and sense of environmental awareness among the Thai villagers along that stretch of the Mekong River. So let me show you my slide here. So what you see here is the result of what they call Taiban Research. It's villager-led research that documented local ecological knowledge in Changkong. And this started with the Pakmun Dam, where villagers wanted to create baseline information for the impacts they would face from the dam. So villagers would take the lead in documenting traditional ecological knowledge and covering topics that academics don't usually cover. So things like local culture, tradition, fishing gears, and history. So here you can see how fish was documented in quite great detail. You see the local name of the fish matched with their scientific names, accompanied by detailed descriptions, including their weight, length, habitat, behavior, breeding season, fishing season, so on and so forth. So this, they also documented, this in this wonderful map of that stretch of the Mekong River. It documented the names of all these ecological systems along the river, the local names, and you can see, depictions of significant sites in terms of religion or livelihoods as well. So these sort of efforts, I think, have managed to raise environmental awareness about the river in that stretch, and also serves as a record for future generations, to understand what was in the Mekong River. So in the Changkong Conservation Group also has supported community-based conservation initiatives in that area. This sort of long-term engagement, environmental engagement on the ground has had very important impacts. So for example, when the Rapids Blasting Project was revived around 2017, again, the conservation group along with villagers led a very strong campaign against it, and a very rare win for community conservation groups in Southeast Asia. They actually managed to get the project cancelled in 2020. And today, they also still play an important role in raising awareness about dams on the Mekong River. So unlike Keith, who has studied the resettlement of villagers, I'm quite interested in the transboundary responses to dams. So for example, mainstream dams that are built in Laos. How do communities in Thailand and Cambodia respond to this? So at the regional level, civil society groups in Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam have also organized themselves against the construction of dams along the mainstream of the Mekong River. And they've pursued a wide range of strategies to do so. They've used forums, they've organized protests, they've pursue accountability to try through quite innovative methods. So for example, Thai villagers have challenged the extraterritorial obligations of the Thai state and Thai investors in Thai courts with regards to their investments in the Lao dams. So I think one other major area of socio-ecological struggle I see is around the politics of knowledge. So whose knowledge is being valued when it comes to understanding these rivers? So hydropower dams are often discussed in quite technical terms. So state actors, private dam developers and engineers, the Mekong River Commission, they also tend to discuss dams in these very technical scientific terms. But this very specific way of knowing the Mekong River doesn't really capture the multiple ontologies attached to the Mekong River itself, especially in terms of its cultural and spiritual dimensions, which are especially important to indigenous communities along the river. So I'm not saying that scientific knowledge and local knowledge are separate domains of knowledge. They're built upon one another, and often even where you see successful examples of community stewardship over the river, you're going to see, this is based on quite hybrid forms of ecological knowledge. So, however, I think going forward through the official types of consultation procedures around the mainstream dams of the Mekong, these discussions are going to continue to be framed around these technical terms. And I think it's probably important to ask why local ecological knowledge tends to be devalued in the region. So I'll leave it here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ming. We have a half hour left, one question, and we want to have a few minutes for questions. Rita and Keith have responded to the names of the rivers they've talked about. Ming Lee, if you've got anything in there besides the Mekong, please add it into everyone. Final question, Rita, what are the possible implications of these changes for the future of these rivers?
Okay, shall I go first, Jeff?
Yes. Okay, so
actually, as Ming Lee was, telling the story about Mekong River and the how the communities identify the fishes over there, right? It's totally reminded me of what the communities were doing, especially in the upstream Chilewung River, and I quickly dug through my photos because I remember I actually have one of those. So this is just, I don't have that fancy diagram like what Ming Lee showed us, but you can see here, this was the time when I brought students from Singapore to the Chilewung. This was a year before COVID, and you can see actually this is one of the environmental activists in the Chilewung River, showing the students how they actually try to identify the fish in the Chilewung, and they also expressed their worry about the impact of the dry dam on these fishes, and so yeah, I think if I would like to kind of speculate of what will be the future of these rivers, I would like to share first of all a worry and some hope, right? My worry, first of all, I think we start from the bad things first. My worry is that the inequalities are so huge, and I'm just worried about how can we bring these voices so that they can be heard. It seems that there are a lot of things going on the ground, and there are lots of potentials, there are lots of real concerns, as well as promises that if we just look carefully what these communities are doing and how the community actually live along the river, and a lot of them are actually live in harmony with the river, or even if they're not living in harmony, they're living with the river. They are actually connecting with the river. However, the story repeatedly that we hear, even from kids, right, the story of resettlement, it seems that there are these forces that keeps, having these kinds of dominant discourse along the river, what we need to do on the river, how we should see the river, and what kinds of interventions that are needed on the river. And so some communities have to make way, and many times, they are featured, there are these terms that are being smoothened as these are resettlements, but actually another word for it is actually evictions. These communities were evicted. And we need to see when we use the term resettlement and when we use the term eviction, the kinds of inequalities, power inequalities that are involved in these processes are actually magnified or diminished depending on the kinds of terms that we are using. So that's my worry. Like what are the chances that these voices from the ground will actually be heard, especially in the official discourses. Now, the hope that I have is actually, it seems that with these great inequalities that are going on for many, many decades, and throughout history, actually, it seems that the voices are still there. I don't know how long they will stay there, and how much time we have actually in trying to harness these voices, but they're still there. The mapping of the fishes, the kinds of efforts to fight evictions, and I would say that the kinds of possible solutions, so-called. I mean, some communities actually come up with their own solutions on, how to improve the lives along the rivers. I mean, if we see the kinds of images of, degraded settlements along the river, those actually form the stereotypes of what how the communities actually live their lives along the river. But it doesn't mean that they are standing still. There are actually efforts to organize and to improve their own situation, even if they have very little resources. And so these kinds of efforts from the communities along the rivers are actually the kinds of things that keeps me hopeful of the future of the rivers. And I think as researchers who care about rivers, I think as a self-reflection, I think this gives us a lot of homework and on how to think about research agenda in the future, how to better capture all these dynamics and learn from these different cases, and to hopefully magnify the hopeful voices rather than perpetuating the worries that we have along the rivers of Southeast Asia right now. All right, thanks, Jeff.
Ming Li?
Hey, so I think with the Mekong River, I mean, of course, in the future, the risk is that the river is going to be transformed into this very highly engineered landscape with stagnant pools of water instead of a free-flowing river. And unfortunately, this seems like a quite likely scenario that's going to continue, especially given that the Thai government has just agreed to sign power purchase agreements with the Lao government for 3 controversial midstream dams along the Mekong River. So the Pak Meng Dam, the Pak Lai Dam, and the Luang Prabang dams. Even though Cambodia has, officially issued a moratorium on Mekong dams until 2030, there is no guarantee that this moratorium is going to be extended beyond that period. And I'm not even talking about dam development or the tributaries of the Mekong River. They're very important tributary systems that also contribute towards the ecological functioning of the Mekong River. And I think quite worryingly is that these developments are taking place despite quite faulty consultation mechanisms, poor quality EIAs, climate change, and also actually taking place in the face of very strong scientific evidence that points towards the devastating impacts that these dams are going to have on fisheries, floodplains, and the delta of the Mekong River. So under such a scenario, I think we are really seeing this happen, that communities are maybe forced into increasingly precarious livelihoods. So while previously they could catch an abundance of fish, both for subsistence and to sell, with less fish catch, people have to go further and fish for longer to get fish, putting them in quite precarious situations. People increasingly also have to engage in wage labor. So those who cannot afford to migrate, they have to carry very large, heavy bags of cockles on the Tonle Sap Lake. Those who can, they migrate out to the cities to work in construction, or they migrate to Thailand to work in factories. But it does take capital to invest and to transition towards alternative livelihoods, which not all communities can afford, or not everyone within the community can afford. So I think this links very much to what Rita is talking about in terms of inequality. So there might be a widening of inequality, especially for families cannot afford to buy land for farming, for example. So it's the poorest community members in the Mekong who are going to be at risk of food insecurity, especially as fish forms a major part of their protein in their diets, especially in Cambodia and Laos. And this also means, I think, the loss of a lot of intangible cultural heritage around the lives of rivers. So in the case of the Mekong, I think to understand the future of the Mekong, you can't just look at the river itself. You have to look at the go beyond the spatial boundaries of the river basin and to look at these global, national, and local processes that are driving these sort of development interventions in the region. So energy futures, for example, is very closely tied to the future of the Mekong River. And that's why you're going to see, I think, a lot of effort by civil society researchers or aid agencies to turn the conversation towards, instead of hydropower, what alternative forms of renewable energy can we look at? They've reviewed Thailand's power projections to see if they really need all these extra energy. However, these conversations about energy and also energy planning, these are taking place quite separate from conversations about the Mekong River and the environment. So, how can we, bridge these two different areas of discussions? I know it sounds very depressing, but yeah, it's really important to also continue to focus on how civil society and communities have, continue to fight for their rights. So the campaign against hydropower dams, I think, has really helped to build some capacity for local communities to advocate for themselves. It's really important to pay attention to the people who have a lot of investment in the future of the river, and important to, I guess, find platforms for them to continue to raise their visions for the future of the Mekong River, and perhaps, looking at examples of how communities have been successfully engaged in stewardship over the Mekong River, community-based natural resource management, can really highlight, I think, the value of communities in decision-making.
Thank you, Ming Li. Now, Keith, I know you're going to give us an upbeat message, right?
Yeah, I'll just keep it very brief to allow time for some questions. Basically, what do I think is the future? Sort of in the stories of the political ecology of Rupture through these dam sites in Laos, I want to be careful not to tell only negative stories, and I'm glad that Ming Li has focused on the civil society angle and the potentials and opportunities for that. In the Hnbun example, there are positive outcomes with the resettlement process, including a better school, better healthcare, improved road access to markets. So some people are doing okay, and some people are even doing very well out of the process. The fact is, however, that a lot of people are not. And in my recent, I did a sort of a 25 household survey just before COVID in early 2020 in January. And from that community, I found that the average US dollar wage income was around $900. And one of the poorest people in the communities had an annual income of under $50 that year. So, certainly there's a lot of people who are not benefiting from the battery of Asia. And, I see these, ongoing agrarian transformations, new inequalities, new ecological stresses. And, if I had to summarize the changes, I would summarize it as, a way of life along a river that is no longer possible.
Thank you very much, Keith. Now we have finished our 3 questions. You've all done an excellent job. Let me ask some questions. We've got 3 or 4 questions here. Rita's asked to answer this first one. I'll let her, but if anybody else wants to pop in and answer it, they may. It seems that governments are mostly looking at the macro pictures when they decide to intervene and disrupt the natural flow of river. However, I feel researchers are more often looking into micro pictures, impacts on individuals and communities. What are some of the ways this disparity can be resolved?
Okay, so I'll take on that question first, Jeff. I think, when we talk about researchers, right? I think researchers on rivers are not only us in this room. There are lots of other kinds of research also being conducted on rivers. So we here, I mean, I'm an urban sociologist, and there are human geographers also in this forum, and that's the focus that we choose for our studies. But this is by no means the only kind of studies along the rivers. Now, the question is, why do researchers like us, or some human geographers, sociologists, anthropologists, why do researchers focus on the micro level? It's because I would argue that oftentimes that those are the voices that are not really heard, and I think those are the important voices to be heard out there. So when we choose the focus of the research, is also important. Again, I'm going to go back to the kind of inequalities that that I was describing earlier. That we also have to be very conscious that when we talk about rivers, we are really talking about really unequal geographies here, and it is very difficult, if not impossible, to be quote unquote neutral about it. If you're being neutral, that means that that basically it's being embroiled in this constellation of powers that are trying to dictate the discourses of the rivers. And so we need to be clear first as researchers, I would say, that where do we place ourselves in this constellation of power along the river? Because whatever research that we do may actually eventually impact. I mean, we may not realize that, but the research that we do may actually impact the course of the, especially that the government usually talk about macro and researchers talk about micro. I think, you know, even when the governments okay, I have this notion here that my connection is unstable. I hope I'm still audible over there. But I would say that that's why also the reason why I started with those macro images, right? That it seems different from everybody else. But I want to say that when we do research on Southeast Asia, it's actually very important for us to connect across scales. So even when we talk about micro, it doesn't mean that we don't understand what is going on the macro level. Whether the government understands what is going on the micro level, I wouldn't actually speak for the government, okay? But I would say that even if the researchers are talking about the micro level, it doesn't mean that we should just talk about the micro. We are actually connecting across scales. And when we talk about river, even if we are looking at one particular community, we are nesting it in a larger river system, so that we understand that this larger river system has this kind of pattern, and this is how it affects this community and that community, right? So I think this ability to assess across scales is very important when we are studying rivers in Southeast Asia, so that we don't actually lose the kind of the important messages from the communities, and we still be able to locate these voices in the larger pattern of rivers. All right. Okay, Jeff.
Thank you, Rita. I am not going to ask anybody else that question because we've got several other questions. Somebody asked a climate change question. I know that we're doing north of the equator and south of the equator, and so climate change is occurring differently. I'm going to go to Keith and Ming Lee. In mainland Southeast Asia, there has been a number of droughts recently. There's actually been an argument that this is leading to desiccation of the region. Climate change is leading to long-term desiccation. This is not your field of study, but do you have anything to say to that?
Who should go first?
You go ahead.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm not a climate change expert. Just a quick point on the previous question, if I may. I could tell the complex governance story. My PhD student has submitted a fascinating thesis where he analyzes what he calls the vertical and institutional disconnects which produce poor resettlement outcomes within the bureaucracy. And of course, there's another whole story to tell about the political economy of dams and the amount of money that is made during the construction phase of hydropower, which is where a lot of the profits get locked in. So I'm told local stories, but I am aware of the sort of broader scales that are happening. In terms of how climate change is affecting this story, the story that I told, I suppose, yeah, with increased, irregular precipitation patterns, droughts, we could start to see how hydropower dams, their functioning and profitability could be affected, as well as, with new typhoons coming, increased typhoons coming in, which led to the collapse of the Zapian Zainam Noi project. So new potentials for instability with climate change with the hydropower program in the Mekong region, I would say.
Is that okay, Ming? Okay, you want that?
Yeah, I mean, even with the drying up of the Mekong, of course, there's this debate about whether is this caused by dams or is this caused by climate change. But of course, it's a drought is a climate change issue, but dams are making the issue a lot worse. So you've had, in 2016, major drought. Vietnam and Cambodia asked China to release water from its dams. So I guess it just goes to show that, with so much water being held back behind the dams upstream and other tributaries, how is this going to make the impacts of climate change even worse? So, if there weren't any dams on the river, perhaps people would not be in such a precarious position that they are today. If you go into the Tonle Sap Lake, it's quite a depressing picture. You can see how dry it is. You can see how hard it is for people to fish and go about their everyday livelihoods. So climate change is definitely something that's, already impacting them over there.
Thank you, Ming Li. We've had a lot of talk. Well, I'm not sure this question is fair because Rita has been all urban and Ming Li have been rural. And I think you're all lowland dynamics. But the question is, could you each speak to the social ruptures in the urban-rural, upland, lowland dynamics, or other geographies in relation to dam and dam building in your respective areas? Does anybody want to take that on, or you think we've covered it?
There is an urban-rural dynamic with hydropower where, there is money to be made. And from my observations in Laos, a lot of that value is sort of being captured and circulated within urban spaces as opposed to getting out, trickling down into rural communities. There's also, of course, a strong upland lowland dynamic in terms of where most of the dams are located in the uplands. There's an ethnic minority aspect to resettlement in many cases for hydropower projects.
Yeah, I also agree that there is this disparity between the urban and the rural. They're very much connected. There is this urban bias, of course, when we look at how rivers develop. Hydropowers, of course, most electricity actually goes to power cities, and any urban related infrastructures, any industries that are related to urban economies. But I also say that, in the case of urban river, like the Chilewong, the kinds of degradation that you see actually is very much impact of urbanization, that many of the rural areas were actually taken over by the spillover effects of the development of Jakarta as this primate city in Indonesia. So a lot of housing developments, for example, they're growing on the outskirts of Jakarta. They're actually eating into all these river systems, the lake, the water retention lake, the natural retention lake. And they dry them and then they make them housing developments. They are not actually in the city of Jakarta, but they are very much attached to the economy of Jakarta. Then they used to be pretty much rural areas, but and these are being encroached also by the economies of the urban. And so I would say that the urban bias and the disparity is really stark in the case of Chilewong.
I'm going to go to a question that Rita answered online, but was actually addressed to Ming Li, I guess. But yes, they were all colonial countries. So it applies to all of you. I'm wondering if any of the participants might comment on the kind of post-independence changes that occurred in the government of these rivers. Asked because my understanding is that at least in Cambodia, the French colonial period involved rather restrictive control of fishing concessions, which probably shifted after independence. Ming Lee, I'll start with you, and then Rita, if you, I don't know if anybody can see well, if they go to answer questions, they can probably see what you wrote. Yeah.
I think Cambodia is an interesting case because you did have these French colonial era fishing concessions. And then after the Khmer Rouge came, and then, after the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian government actually put in place a fishing lot system that was, almost appeared to be a continuation from the French fishing lots arrangement. And these fishing lots that were, given to private companies were massive. They, took up a large proportion of the Tonle Sap Lake. And I think that's kind of the era of the fishery resources of the lake really started to happen, so much so that in 2012, the government decided to cancel the fishing lot system because I think it was just terribly unsustainable. So there's definitely been a shift. But I think in terms of the Cambodian government, they're still very reactive in terms of dealing with these sort of challenges. So for example, deforestation around the Tonle Sap Lake has also been taking place for a long time. It was only quite this year that they cracked down on some quite high-level government officials in Kampong Chenang, I think, and kind of reclaimed that land back to reforest it. So all these are quite reactionary, and I think they do need to be a bit more proactive about protecting the lake.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then I'll let you go around and say a few finishing words. This question was really for Anthony, but it just popped up. Do you have any insights into riverine scholars or communities we could look to in the Philippines, similar to the works that you've shared in your own context? I mean, Anthony does the Philippines, but do any of you know anything about the Philippines?
Just that Michael Fabini might be one to check with. He does more ocean fisheries in the Philippines, marine resources, but he would probably be aware of any research on aquatic resources in the Philippines. Type
the name into chat, will you please? Okay. I'm hesitant to ask this question, but here goes. It's the one that comes up every time. Sorry, anonymous attendee. How does China view the social and ecological damage on the Mekong River, considering its own activities upriver and involvement with electricity to Laos? Do you want to engage in that, or it's just too?
I'll engage with the second part. Maybe Ming Lee is interested in engaging in the first part.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll speak about China's upstream dams. So China would not view these as social and ecological damages to the river. To them, they are doing everyone in the Mekong River Basin a favor by regulating the flow of the Mekong River. So, less flooding in the dry season, more water in the dry season, less flooding in the wet season. So I think that whole history of, China and how they view their rivers and how they've engineered their rivers does play into this. So I think they're seeing it purely from an electricity generating perspective. And they don't want to admit that it's causing social ecological damages downstream. And I think even the downstream countries are somewhat reluctant to label it as so. So if you look at the whole politics of knowledge around whether China is sharing enough data about its upstream dam operations, I think the reluctance of the Chinese government to share all these data is a reflection of their reluctance to really engage in these sort of conversations around social and ecological damages further downstream.
Thank you, Ming Li.
Yeah, so on EDLT, or Electricity to Lao Transmission Company, this is a fascinating situation that's sort of ongoing as we talk. For those who might not be aware, Electricity to Laos Transmission Company was, the transmission entity was spun off from the state-owned enterprise Electricity to Laos, and then 90% of that company was sold to a Chinese investor. So basically, a Chinese enterprise now is sort of owns 90% of Laos's electricity grid. And so what are the implications of that? And, it's a fascinating story. My understanding is that, Laos was in pretty sharp danger of defaulting on sovereign debt payment if they hadn't have made this move. So I think that netted around $600 million for the Lao government to help them to avoid a sovereign debt default, which was itself kind of related to getting a bit over their skis, as Canadians would say, with overbuilding dam projects and entering into too many debt arrangements with private dam developers, especially through signing power purchase agreements in which this Lao state-owned enterprise had to purchase the output from a lot of investors, whether or not that output was actually required for the markets. So basically, this whole situation is now really interesting because one of the main problems is that Laos's domestic transmission grid has not been completed, and this is creating bottlenecks for efficiently moving around electricity to markets, basically. And so the investment from China now brings new capital. Estimated around $2 billion is needed to complete the transmission grid, and that could, sort of solve some of Laos's current overcapacity problems, especially with projects targeting the domestic market. So, Chinese investment is now really crucial to how the Lao hydropower sort of program plays out over the next little while, and it'll be fascinating to see what happens with that.
Thank you. I think you've all done an excellent job. Do you want to, and does I'll go around the room again and let you say a few words if you want to at the end. Rita, any summary words?
Yeah, I think I really enjoy the discussion today, and I think again, to look at rivers, I would say that rivers in Southeast Asia, we do need to place them in this region that is really rapidly developing, rapidly urbanizing, as well as the kinds of impact of those developments and urbanizations on the societies and the environment. So the kinds of inequalities in terms of political inequalities, social inequalities, economic inequalities that emerge from these rapid developments that are often being sort of like legitimized in the official narratives as necessary, but at the same time, the impacts of these developments will be unequal to different groups of communities. So I would say that looking at rivers really compel us to critically look at these developments, especially when it comes to their social and environmental impacts.
Thank you, Rita. Keith?
Yeah, maybe just for a last comment, I'll respond to one question here on the potential for environmental assessments to support better community engagement and to create more sustainable hydropower projects. Of course, the EIA process is important to support, and EIAs can be done a lot better in Laos. But I think, just the, there's an entire political economy of dam building that drives the process forward, and the EIA regulatory system itself is just not strong enough, not equipped to be able to really respond to that completely. So strengthening Laos's environmental assessment program is an important and worthy objective, but we shouldn't see that as a silver bullet for addressing these issues, because the roots of the outcomes that we're seeing go in deep into the political economy of resourcification in Laos, you could say.
Thank you, Keith, and I'm glad you took that last question on. Ming Lee.
Yeah, so I guess just to sum up, yeah, there are just so many perspectives with which we can study the river. So I guess all of us here in the panel are really interested in that grounded perspective, because these are the people who bear the cost of development interventions to the river, whereas as Rita said, these costs are not distributed equally geographically. So we really need this grounded understanding of whether development schemes work or not. And that's why we study communities. But I mean, also zooming out, there are 60 million people who live in the Mekong River Basin. So the study of one community, of course, is just a snapshot of what's happening, but it does provide very good insight into what's happening. But yes, of course, it's also important to engage with all these other perspectives, whether it's scientific perspectives or legal perspectives, political economy perspectives. I think they're all equally important in terms of bringing together that holistic picture of how Southeast Asian rivers are changing, how people are impacted by these changes, and what implications these have for the future.
Well, it is 3:53 on my clock, 3:33 on my clock. So I think that's the end of the webinar. But I thank you all very much. I think you did an excellent job. And I look forward to meeting Keith and Rita in person someday. Mahalo nui loa, as we say in Hawaii. All right, aloha.